I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at 4 of Logic's modulation effects. Sometimes what you want to do when you're working with a sound is to thicken it and add more character to it. And in particular, these 4 modulation effects that we're going to look at allow you to do that in some really interesting ways. The first one we're going to look at is chorus. What I've got here is a pad sound from retro synth with nothing added to it at this stage altogether. It's a kind of quite retro 70s kind of synth pad sound. Now you'll be aware what happens when you add detune to a synth sound. What effectively happens is you take a second oscillator and you detune it against the first so that the overall sort of pitch footprint of that sound gets a bit wider and the whole thing sounds thicker as a result. And chorus allows us to do that. Within Logic's drop-down menus, we've got one which is called modulation, and within here there are a range of effects, and chorus is right up here at the top. By selecting this, what we have a chance to do is to add a sort of an extra voice. And the way that the chorus effect works is it allows us to change the kind of speed of a second signal that's sitting underneath the first one. So what we can do is to add this second signal, and we can choose the sort of speed of that detune, if you like, and the intensity, the strength of it as well, using these 2 dials. Whereas over here on the right-hand side, we can set the balance between the original dry signal and the exclusively wet signal. So setting a balance somewhere in the middle will allow us to hear this thickening effect that we're talking about. And without it, so let's have that again, put that back in, and we're just going to increase the rate and the intensity a little bit more, and we'll hear an even fuller version of this chorus effect. So in this version, we can really hear this kind of background low frequency oscillator that's producing this kind of offset, this rate change for us. It's too wide now. So what I'm going to do is to slow it back down and turn the intensity back down. And now we're a little bit closer to probably where we want to be for this kind of thickening effect. Again, I quite like the original sound, so we're just going to blend in a little bit of this underneath. Now, chorus works by producing one additional extra voice on top of the original sound. What we want to do next is to experiment with what happens when we go a bit further than that. We're going to come back to modulation, and this time we're going to look at the ensemble effect. Now, this allows us to add up to 8 additional voices over the top of the original dry sound. Again, our output mix over here on the right-hand side allows us to set a blend between dry and wet levels. So we'll still have mostly the original signal, but we'll also have some of the ensemble effect coming in underneath it. Now, over here on the left-hand side, I can add the number of voices I want to add. So if I want to have 8 separate additional channels being added to this dry sound, I can. Or I can take it down to just 1 extra additional voice, which would be like our chorus effect. And you can see that as I add these, we get these extra little sort of green lines showing us each new individual voice that's being added to the original. So what I can do with each individual voice is I can work out how wide I want each one of these to be from a stereo spread point of view. And what's interesting is that just like in chorus, the way that these are added is by using LFOs, which are effectively changing the rate and the speed of the way that they behave. And there are 3 LFOs within the Ensemble plugin. We've got 2 kind of regular ones, which can have their own individual rates and the intensity, which we saw in the chorus plugin as well. And then we've also got a random LFO. So rather than just a smooth waveform, which is just gently morphing underneath the sound, what we've got is a chance to do something a bit more radical and wild. And we can see that if we increase the rate and the intensity of the random LFO, what we've got a chance to do is to just sort of see the kind of behavior that's going to be inflicted on this sound in ways where the voices will be sort of cross-modulating or producing unpredictable behavior underneath the way that the 2 more regular waveforms might work. So let's turn the intensity down so we don't end up with something too extreme. And what we should find is a kind of super chorus effect now, where we've got sort of chorus plus. Again, it's a really retro effect, this, and as we increase the number of voices, we should hear an even more kind of lush response. So that's working well when you've got the sort of behavior of these extra voices working underneath the original sound. What we can do is to sort of back that output mix level down, so we're just tickling those extra voices in underneath the other sounds. Now, so far what we've got are sounds that are kind of being doubled or modulated in real time. We're effectively sort of having our original voice and then we're widening the pitch base in real time. There are two other effects we're going to look at, the first one of which is flanging, and what this does is to perform a sort of similar trick, but what it does is to offset the second voice that's added to the first. So rather than the two sounds being triggered at exactly the same time, but with a sort of different pitch footprint, what we're doing this time is saying, okay, the first sound is going to happen, and then the second one is going to be delayed a moment later, so that effectively we're changing the relationship in the phase of the original sound and the doubled signal that comes on top. Again, we've got a mix dial, which is going to allow us to set the balance between the original sound and the processed flange signal. But here we're controlling the rate at which this doubled signal appears. Here we're controlling the intensity or volume of that doubled signal, and the feedback control allows us to decide how much of the new second signal we then feed back in to become reprocessed. That's a little bit confusing, but it will become more obvious as we listen through to it. We'll hear the characteristic flanging sound, and we'll hear what happens as we increase feedback in particular. I'll back intensity and feedback down. We'll keep mix at 50%, and we'll increase these as we listen through. So we get these really interesting undulations which become very sci-fi when we turn the rate up considerably. That's that second signal effectively being modulated through a low frequency oscillator, and we can hear the speed of that as it's affecting the sort of overtones of the sound that's being added on top of the original pad sound. And finally, we've got phasing. What phasing allows us to do is just close the flanger down and come back to modulation one more time. What phasing allows us to do is to do a sort of more sophisticated version of what the flanging effect is doing. This time we've got two separate LFOs, but we've also got various stages or processes or versions of phasing which have been modeled within this plugin. So lots of different ways in which phasing can be applied. This idea of taking overtone signals, which again, their phase has been offset against the original signal in ways that produce interesting characteristic overtones. Once again, we've got a feedback control, which is going to allow those to be fed back into the main signal as well. And as I say, this time we've got two LFOs rather than one. These can have their own speed set, and we can set a balance between them here. So we can either just work with one LFO or the other, or a combination of two. These LFOs, interestingly, can be tempo synced as well. So if you want the overtone behavior, the sort of thing we heard a moment ago within the flanger, to be locked to the tempo of your track, you can do that, which of course therefore means that those undulations are going to be in time with the other components or beat elements of your track. So what we can do is just press play and modulate some of these parameters and begin to see what it's possible to do with phasing. So you can hear there are some really interesting effects, different sort of tonal footprints that come from these different stages, which we can modulate over here on the left-hand side. And you can begin to see how the rate of change of those doubled signals can begin to work, particularly when those two LFOs interact with one another. So within this video, we've looked at 4 separate ways of adding doubled signals to a core sound within Logic. And the great thing about this is that all of them thicken the sounds that you're working with in really interesting ways.